Okay, so now we have another story, another kind of break in the action, so to speak. This has nothing to do with Joseph. This is about Judah and his adventures somewhere else away from the rest of the family. It's a complete break in the narrative of what's going on with Joseph. I'm gonna, just like I did back with chapter 34 with the account of Dinah and Shechem. I'm going to go ahead and read this chapter through from start to finish and then comment on it after I'm done. At that time, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Hira. There, Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. He married her and lay with her. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son who was named E-R. Not U-R as in Ur of the Chaldees, the town, the place. As in E-R, like She conceived again and gave birth to a son and named him Onan. She gave birth to still another son and named him Shelah. It was at Kizib that she gave birth to him. That's 3 sons. That's at least 3 years taking place here now. So this is at least 3 years removed after the selling of Joseph, because Judah's had 3 sons since then. That's assuming they all came out back to back to back, which they may have. But there may have been some time in between, or they may have been pretty quick together. But this is still 3 years now after the selling of Joseph. And Judah is apparently away from the rest of the family. I'll talk about it more once I finish this chapter. Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, "Lie with your brother's wife, Tamar, and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to produce offspring for your brother." This was a major part of their culture. But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, because it would be reckoned to his dead brother So whenever he lay with his brother's wife, Tamar, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from producing offspring for his brother. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight. He's supposed to provide a son for Tamar to carry on Ur's family line. So he put him to death also. I don't know how he did it, he just did it. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Live as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up." For he thought, he may die too, like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. She's being saved in marriage for Shelah. She needs to have a son. She needs to have a son and grow up a family line in her dead husband's name. And Judah is legally obligated to provide Shelah for her so she can do that. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. When Judah had recovered from his grief, so this is going on for a while. It's been a while since Joseph was sent to Egypt. When Judah had recovered from his grief, I mean, these sons apparently grew up and were mature men at this time. So this is a lengthy period of time this is covering. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah, to the men who were shearing his sheep, and his friend Hira the Adullamite went with him. That's the whole reason why he went down in the first place, is to be with this guy. When Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is on the way to Timnah to shear his sheep," she took off her widow's clothes, which apparently she'd had on for a while, covered herself with, because he has not been giving her in marriage to his third son like he should have, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance to Eniam, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that, though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, "Come now, let me sleep with you." His wife is dead. He wants some action. He sees his prostitute. He's going to get some. "And what will you give me to sleep with you?" she asked. "I'll send you a young goat from my flock," he said. Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it? She said. So she can't be certain he's going to live up to his end of the bargain. He said, what pledge should I give you? Basically collateral. Your seal and its cord, and the staff in your hand, she answered. So he gave them to her, and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. After she left, she took off her veil, and put on her widow's clothes again. But she has his stuff as collateral for this goat payment that he said he would send. Meanwhile, Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adulamite in order to get his pledge back from the woman. So he did send the goat. He wants his stuff back. But he did not find her. He asked the men who lived there, where is the shrine prostitute who was beside the road at Enaim? There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here, they said. So he went back to Judah and said, I didn't find her. Besides, the men who lived there said there hasn't been any shrine prostitute here. Then Judah said, so he's been tricked, and he knows he's been tricked. Let her keep what she's got, or we will become a laughingstock. After all, I did send her this young goat, but you didn't find her. This could be scandalous if this gets out. Who knows what's going to happen, huh? About 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she is now pregnant. Judah said, bring her out and burn her to death. He's been offended. His honor has been tarnished. There's nothing worse than that. Well, there is something worse than that, actually. I'll get to that in a minute. But his honor has been tarnished. He has been reduced in the sight of the men around him. This is terrible. Something must be done about this. The woman who has hurt his image must be made to pay. As she was being brought out, so they're going to do it. They're going to set her on fire somehow. I don't know if they burned them at a stake. That was a Middle Ages thing, burning people at stakes. I don't know if they're going to burn her at a stake or throw her in an oven or what they're going to do. But they're bringing her out to do it, whatever it is. She sent a message to her father-in-law. I am pregnant by the man who owns these, she said, and she added, see if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are. She obviously would have expected Judah to have had this sort of punishment in mind for her once he found out about her condition. That's why she wanted the stuff to begin with, to use as collateral against him. Judah recognized them and said, she is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah. And he did not sleep with her again. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. As she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand. They came out hand first, or tried to at least. So the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, this one came out first. But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out, and she said, so this is how you have broken out. And he was named Perez, which according to the footnotes means breaking out. Then his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was given the name Zerah, which means scarlet or brightness. Okay, so I covered this. Okay, so I talked a little bit more about this as I was going on than I really intended to, but so what's going on here? Why is this story included? Okay, well, to find this out, there's a couple of other places we need to turn in the script. By itself, you'd have no idea. Simply reading through Genesis, the reason why that material is included is not at all evident in the text as it's by itself. To get the full meaning of why that particular chapter is in this account, we have to turn all the way here to Matthew in the beginning of the book, the genealogy of Jesus Christ, where he starts off by saying a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. He goes on from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. And Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. And Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, and then he goes on down the list, and eventually ends up at Jesus. So this chapter is included to show us how the lineage of Jesus Christ goes from Judah to Perez, whom Judah had with Tamar, on down all the way to Christ. Then that's the long-term ultimate fulfillment and meaning of this passage. The ultimate reason why it's here. In addition, though, there is a shorter term purpose of this passage, still beyond the scope of Genesis itself, or even the works of Moses by themselves, but not as far down the future as Jesus Christ goes. At the end of Ruth, we get the genealogy of David, and his line runs through Perez, this son of Judah. At the end of Ruth, chapter 4, starting in verse 18, says, "This then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Abinadab, Aminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz," the character in Ruth, the guy who actually marries Ruth, Boaz the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, Jesse the father of David. So that genealogy connects Perez to David. So that is why this weird story about Judah and Tamar is included in Genesis. By itself, simply reading through Genesis, or even the entire works of Moses, you'd have no idea. Now, the story we read about Dinah and the Shechemites, which was really about Simeon and Levi, the reason why that story is included does eventually become revealed when we get down to Judah's, or so many J names, Jacob's blessings on his sons, and he passes over Simeon and Levi, who are the second and third born, to get down to Judah, who is the fourth born, to give him his blessing and birthright. He passes over Reuben, the firstborn, for a different reason, which is also mentioned. So in there, with that example, we have this weird story that kind of sticks out in the middle of something else and seems to have nothing to do with anything, but later on it reveals the reason for its inclusion is revealed. Here, the reason for the inclusion of this story isn't revealed until later in the Bible. The idea that the sons that were born to Tamar through this union with her father-in-law, one of them ended up becoming a descendant of David, and then later on, ancestor of David, and descendant of, and then later on of Christ. So that ultimately is why this chapter is here. It's a fascinating look into the mindset of the ancient cultures, okay? First of all, this is taking place during the time when Joseph is in Egypt. And apparently it's a pretty long period of time, because Judah has 3 sons, and they all grow up, apparently, to young adulthood, or at least late teenagehood. I'm not sure how old these 2 older sons are, and Onan, when they get put to death by God. I don't think they could be too terribly old, because Judah ends up moving down to Egypt with the rest of them, which is 22 years later. So I don't think that either of them could be too old. Maybe young men in their late teens, 20-ish. I really don't know. I really don't know how this fits into the timeline. Like I said, the timeline of Jacob, and Jacob is still alive during this incident, is extremely weird and extremely tight. And it's hard for me to kind of work out how all these events could have fit into that timeline, but they're in there somewhere. So he had 3 sons. 2 of them grew up at least to be old enough to get engaged to a woman and married to a woman. I don't know what age they would have had to be to do that. And they were both put to death by God for their wickedness. I'm not sure what the first one did to be considered wicked by God, but the second one was considered wicked because he refused to have a son on behalf of his dead brother, the first son of Judah. And this, again, this is an insight into the way their culture worked. Because I said when I was reading through this section, that when Tamar dishonors Judah by being his daughter-in-law and becoming a prostitute and getting pregnant, like, that was a horrifying thing. Like, Judah's honor is Judah's name and reputation amongst the men of his town is now besmirched and dishonored. Like, that's horrible. Like, the only thing to do then is take the woman out and burn her to death. Okay, it's like when a woman besmirches your name and honor, it's like that's almost the worst thing that can happen to you, but not quite. Because the worst thing that can happen to you, like the absolute, and this is no hyperbole, okay, this is the absolute worst thing that could happen to you in this culture. And this is true for the Israelites. This is true for all the people and the cultures around them at this time. They would have all thought this. And we'll see this reflected. We've already seen it reflected And some of the stories before about Abraham wanting to know where his son was going to come from and wanting God to guarantee him, give him a sign to guarantee that he would have a son. And just, we've already seen it reflected, and it's going to continue being a part of the narrative all the way through the Old Testament at least. That the worst thing that could happen to you in this culture, the absolute worst thing imaginable, it's not simply having your name dishonored by the acts of a shameful woman. That's pretty bad. Okay, that's pretty bad. But the worst thing that could happen to you is that you die without producing any sons, or at least any children, period. Ideally, sons. If you had only a daughter, at least your daughter can marry somebody and have a son in your name. But if you die without having children, that's it. Like, that's the worst thing that could happen to you. There is nothing more, because your name is cut off. Like, then your name is cut off from the earth. There is nothing more unimaginably horrible to these people than dying without leaving any posterity. Like, that's it. Like, that is the worst thing that could happen to them. These people at this time were not worried about dying and going to hell. Okay, that did not. They knew they were going to die. They all accepted that. They all thought they were going to go to some place in the ground called the underworld or whatever, and they had different concepts of what that was. But they weren't afraid of going to a place that we now call hell. Like, that idea doesn't come along until many years later. These people, their most terrifying thought, the thing that would just send shivers down their spines like nothing else could, was the idea of dying without having any descendants, not having any posterity. Preferably sons, preferably lots of sons, but at least one son. If you didn't get a son, at least a daughter, because then you could at least have her get pregnant through somebody and carry on your family name through her son. And we will find this reflect. We've already seen it mentioned, hinted at in the story of Abraham, and we're going to find this being a constant cultural theme all throughout the history of the Old Testament. We're going to see it in Judges when we get down to Jephthah. Jephthah makes a vow. Jephthah is one of the judges of Israel, one of the later judges, one of the worst judges. Makes a foolish vow to give up someone in sacrifice after God blesses him in battle or something along those lines. And the person who comes out of his house that he has to give a sacrifice is his daughter, his only daughter. So after he kills her, which he does apparently do, he has no more descendants. And she, the girl herself, is despondent, not because she's going to die, but because she's not ever going to be married. She's going to die childless. She's going to die a virgin, never having produced any heirs for her father. So her father's name, family name, will die off from the earth. Job. We'll talk about Job. One of the things that people misunderstand about the book of Job, when Job's children die, all 10 of his children, his 7 sons and his 3 daughters, all die at the beginning of the book of Job. What he is upset about is not necessarily the fact that his 10 children are all now dead. Okay? We assume this. Like, this is how we picture it. And it makes sense. Okay? We assume that as a parent, he is now grieving the loss of his 10 children. But he isn't really, at least not in the way that we would. At least not in the way that we would think of it, or the way that we think he should, or the thing that he would, or the way that we would if he were in his condition. What he is really upset about, and what he talks about, and what he goes on to complain about, is that now that his children are dead, his life has no meaning, has no purpose. It's as if he might as well never have been born. Because he has no sons or daughters, he ends up getting getting daughters again. Because he now has no posterity, no one to carry on his name, his entire life is futile. Everything he has done is meaningless. Everything that he has worked for, everything he has accomplished is meaningless. It will all go to somebody else upon his death. Well, he doesn't have anything. He lost all this stuff in other catastrophes anyway. And all of his accomplishments will now be as if they never happened. Like, he'll go away, and his name will be forgotten from the earth. So he might as well not have been born. That's why he complains and says, I might as well not even have been born. It's not just because he's upset emotionally about his children dying. His specific complaint is that his children dying means his life has now been rendered meaningless, and he might as well have been stillborn, born dead in the womb. Might as well have been, for all the good his life now is worth, he might as well have died in infancy. He's not emotionally upset about losing his children, at least not in the sense that we think he should be or that we think we would be. There'll be a provision in the law about what happens when a man dies and only has daughters. You know, a guy named Zelophehad or whatever, he will have 5 daughters and no sons, and he'll die in a rebellion against God at the book of Numbers. And they're going to come to Moses and say, what do we do? It's like, we need to carry on our father's name somehow. Back when Lot was living in a cave with his 2 daughters, like they said, if we die without knowing a man, our father's name will die out. So we have to have sex with our father to produce sons to carry on his name. So like that would have been the worst that would have been the worst thing imaginable to any of these ancient people, to the Israelites, to the Moabites, to the Ammonites, to the Edomites, to any of them. And there are provisions in their laws, and the law of God had one, the law of Moses provided for this, other laws in the culture at the time, and we can see it right here, even before the law of Moses came along, the written law of Moses came along. Judah's firstborn son dies before he can have a son, after he gets married to Tamar and before he can have a son. So Tamar is, okay, so Judah's second son, Onan, is supposed to have sex with Tamar so she can get pregnant and have a son and raise a family in the firstborn son's name, Onan doesn't like this because he knows that child will not be reckoned to him. So he doesn't want to do it. He doesn't want to impregnate Tamar because he knows that if he does, the child she's going to bear is going to be raised in Er's name, not in his. So that's why he tries to get out of it by dumping his semen out on the ground or something. I'm not really sure exactly how that would have happened. And that's what God is upset about. That's why he kills him, because he's supposed to do that. He has an obligation to carry on, even though his brother is dead and was evil. He has an obligation to carry on his brother's name through having a son through his brother's wife. And that, and in the New Testament, when the Sadducees come up to Jesus with a logic problem trying to disprove the resurrection, the example they're going to go is what happens when you have a woman who's been married to 7 men, all brothers, from first to last, who none of them have sons with her. They all die, and then she dies, and none of them ever had any sons. What happens when the resurrection happens? Whose wife will she be? She was married legally to all 7 of them, okay, but didn't have any sons with any of them. So in the resurrection, whose wife is she going to be? Now they're assuming that the answer, that the riddle itself, disproves the resurrection because there's no answer to the question, which means there can't be a resurrection. We'll get to that much later. But the logic of their argument is entirely based on the custom of handing your widow off to your brother to have sons in your name if you die without sons, because you're supposed to, and he's supposed to do that. Your brother is supposed to do that legally. He's obligated to do that. Because nothing would have been worse to these people. Like, nothing would have been more horrifying to them than to die without any child to carry on their family name. Like, that was the worst thing that could have ever happened to them. Ever happened to them. We think the worst thing that can happen to someone is they go to hell, is they die and go to hell. They go to hell when they die. These people did not think that. They did not believe in hell, well, at least not the way that we do. They believed in death, obviously, and they believed in a land of death, a place of death, a realm of the dead, of Sheol, where the underworld, where the dead went and stayed. They believed that, but they didn't believe that was the worst thing that could happen to them. They didn't believe in hell as we believe in hell. They believed that to them, the worst thing that could happen to them is that they could die without posterity, and they have no one to carry on their name on the earth. The way they lived forever was to make we saw this way back with Abraham. When God called Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldees, and they called him to leave his homeland, leave the place of his birth, and leave his father's household, he didn't promise him eternal life after death, being resurrected back to life again, and living with God. That's not how he promised. That's not what he promised him. He didn't get him by selling him that kind of promise. He got him by saying, I'm going to bless you, I'm going to make your name great, and kings and nations are going to come out of you. Because to Abraham, that's how he lived forever. Abraham was looking, that, and that would have been true for all of them at the time. The way they became great, the way they lived forever, was to make their names great. The way they did that basically was to have lots of sons, or else do lots of great things. Okay, I also mentioned an extra biblical example of this was in Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh tries to find the secret to immortal life and can't do it. Ultimately concludes that man cannot live forever, even though he's 2/3 God. And that in order to live forever, he has to make his name great by doing great things, and that's how he lives forever, by his name living forever. That's just how their culture was. If you can't do that if you don't have lots of sons. So if you don't have lots of sons, if you don't have any sons, if you don't have any daughters at least, then your name not only can your name not become great, your name disappears. You'll be forgotten from the earth, and that is the most terrifying thing that any of these people could have thought of. Having a shameful, sinful woman disgrace you publicly was pretty bad. Okay, that was pretty high up on the list of terrible things that could happen to you, and it deserved swift and harsh retribution. Burn her. What exactly did he say? Bring her out and have her burned to death. Like, that's... men still can't, actually, to this day. We can't tolerate it when our women dishonor us. Like, we just can't have that. But that, as bad as that was, is not the worst thing that could happen to people. At this point in time, the worst thing that could happen was to die without having sons. And that's what happens here. So the whole premise of this story is based on the idea that with having died, his younger brother is supposed to marry Tamar and have sons in his name. He doesn't do that, and then he dies. So he gets put to death because of that. And then Judah, he says to Tamar that he's going to reserve her for his third son, who I guess was still a child, not yet old enough to get married yet. And so he says that I'm going to marry you off to him when he comes of age. But he doesn't. He holds back and doesn't do it. And he's supposed to. His second son was put to death for that same reason. He's supposed to give Tamar to Shelah, the third son, so that she can raise a family, so that she can have sons. That would also take care of her. She's not going to have any value if she'll have to be a prostitute. She even plays on that here by pretending to be one. It's like if she doesn't get sons through Shelah or somebody in Judah's household, she's going to be destitute. She's going to be left as a prostitute. And so she then manipulates him into forcing him into honor his word by dressing up as a prostitute, which is exactly what she's going to have to end up becoming if Judah does not end up following through on his obligations to her. So the entire premise of this story is based on that idea, which is, again, totally contrary to anything that we experience in our culture or think about in our religious experience. So to understand this story, you have to understand that first and foremost. And, of course, the idea that this story ultimately is included to show us where Perez and Zerah, or really Perez because he's the one in the lineage, came from. And that leads directly to David and then later on to Jesus.